On this episode of CyberWatch, a critical vulnerability in Apache OFBiz, cybercriminals who couldn't resist going for gold around the Paris Olympics, and a fundamental flaw in browsers isn't new, but it's still dangerous. All this and a conversation with Shaun Waterman, who wrote the recent CyberWatch article on the cyber attack on blood supplier OneBlood, today in the CyberWatch podcast. Hello, and welcome to the CyberWatch podcast for the week of August 11th, 2024. This is your weekly roundup of the news and analysis published on CyberWatch. I'm your host, Curtis Franklin. Let's get to the news. The researchers at SonicWall Capture Labs have discovered a vulnerability in Apache OFBiz that allows pre-authenticated remote code execution. Considered a publicly disclosed zero-day vulnerability, a patch has been released, and versions 18.12.15 and later remediate this vulnerability. According to the researchers, the bug lies in the logic of the authentication mechanism. If you are using Apache OFBiz, the only method to fix this vulnerability is to apply the patch. There are no other recommended vendor mitigations. And since this is a publicly disclosed vulnerability, the patching should be considered an elevated priority. The bad guys know about it. You should patch now. Over the last 2 weeks, Paris was home to thrilling displays of athleticism and heartwarming displays of sporting spirit. Unfortunately, during the early hours of Saturday, August 3rd, Grand Palais in Paris, France, which was home to events like fencing and taekwondo, was also home to a ransomware attack on the central computing system. That system is responsible for managing data access across 40 primarily small affiliated museums. France's National Cybersecurity Agency maintained that no data exfiltration occurred, though that didn't stop unidentified attackers from issuing a demand for a cryptocurrency ransom within 48 hours. The threat? To release stolen financial data on the dark web. Now, this was, of course, not the only attack on the games. In July, France's high-speed train lines became the target of multiple malicious acts, including physical arson. Such attacks underscore how cybercriminals leverage major events to create chaos and exploit vulnerabilities, impacting both infrastructure and public confidence. These attacks underscore the importance of staying aware of international events, since cybercriminals will always use disruptive events, whether this disruption is good or bad, as cover for malicious acts and attacks. Now, this next news story only concerns you if you use any major web browser. The Oligos security research team recently disclosed a vulnerability present in all major web browsers, including Chromium, Firefox, and Safari. The vulnerability, which has been named 0.0.0.0 day, is the result of what the researchers call a fundamental flaw with how browsers handle network requests. The vulnerability allows attackers to access sensitive services running on local devices running Mac OS and Linux operating systems. For once, Windows is the safe option. The vulnerability takes advantage of the IPv4 address of 0.0.0.0 and the way browsers handle requests. Public websites can access any port on your host without seeing a response. While the vulnerability has no CVSS score or CVE associated with it, according to researchers at Oligo, this vulnerability has a massive impact since it affects all the major browsers running on Mac OS and Linux operating systems. Currently, there are no official fixes for this vulnerability because it's an inherent error in the current browser's function and will have to be fixed on a case-by-case basis for particular applications. So, what is a user to do? First, review the use of localhost. Make a catalog of all applications and services that utilize localhost, specifically IPv4 address 0.0.0.0, and stay informed. This topic is still developing, and new vulnerabilities will be discovered that are utilizing this flaw. Exploitation of the vulnerability is very likely. Happy days. Well, that's the news. Now it's time to talk with Shaun Waterman, an independent journalist who wrote the CyberWatch article on the OneBlood ransomware attack. Today, Shaun comes to us to talk about the breach, how it happened, and how you can keep something like it from happening to your organization. I'm joined today by Shaun Waterman, a journalist of long standing in the technology world, who wrote, as I said in my introduction, a piece on an attack on the blood supplier OneBlood. And we're going to talk about that and what's happened since the article was written. Shaun, welcome to the CyberWatch podcast.
Thank you, Curtis. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, we always begin by asking our guests a little bit about themselves. I said that you were a journalist of long standing. Can you tell us just a little bit about how you came to be sitting here talking to me on our podcast?
Well, sure. I wrote my first story about cybersecurity in 1999 about the antics of a young hacker used the handle Mafia Boy in Canada, who brought down most of e-commerce, the e-commerce world on the East, as it then was, on the East Coast. And I should never look back. I mean, I worked for UPI for a decade, and then for the Washington Times and Politico, Newsweek, at least for the last decade or so, always focused on the cybersecurity and other emerging technology threats. And now I sort of write for the trade press, for Air and Space Forces magazine, and tech policy publications like Compiler, and cyber publications like CyberWatch. So yeah, that's 25 years in the United States, and still this country still surprises me every day.
Well, if it matters, I was born here, and it surprises me pretty much every day as well. So, well, we're glad that you're able to be with us today. Now, you wrote, as I said, this article that appeared last week in CyberWatch on OneBlood and an attack that had a fairly profound impact on them. Can you refresh our memory on what happened to OneBlood?
Well, yeah, on July the 29th, they were struck by a ransomware infection, which basically crippled their ability to computerize the sorting and labeling and dispatch parts of their process, right? So they are a blood supplier and collector. They have donation centers all over the southeast. The buses, the big red buses, are very familiar sights down there as well. So, they have a huge base of donors. They collect the blood products, and then they ship them to hospitals. And the process of sorting and labeling and dispatching all of that stuff to the hospitals was a computerized and automated process. And that process, they had to go back to doing that manually. It created, because they were able to continue collecting donations. And in fact, they said that they issued an appeal for donors. Their donors, they said, responded very well to that. So they had plenty of blood. The problem was getting it labeled, sorted and labeled and shipped to the hospitals. That was the bottleneck this attack created. And what, as a result of that, many hospitals, at least in Florida, I think there was reporting from other states as well, but I focused for the story on Florida. Many hospitals had to reschedule elective surgeries, especially ones that require, like heart surgery, for example, that require them to have, large amounts of blood there in case anything goes wrong, or indeed even if everything goes right. So these elective surgeries were rescheduled, and the hospitals, went into this sort of emergency mode where they don't, where they try and conserve their blood supply in case there are emergencies. And indeed, there's the organisation that used to be called the American Association of Blood Banks. They stood up a special, one of their special disaster and terrorism task forces, and that enables, blood centres in other parts of the country to ship, to fill needs in the southeast as they arise. So that's a sort of real-time national coordination. So, a lot of palaver, frankly, a lot of risk, and a lot of inconvenience and even danger for Florida's hospital patients as a result of this ransomware attack.
This seems to be part of a trend where we're seeing more healthcare organizations targeted by ransomware and other similar attacks. What do you think it is that makes healthcare organizations such attractive targets for the criminals?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that, because, they really are. And the reason is they are dependent on technology. Their operations are super critical, right? Because it's a matter of life and death. They have to be able to function. And, most of them don't have the budget for a proper cybersecurity program. If you compare, say, the banks, banks tend not to get hit with ransomware because they spend billions of dollars on securing their infrastructure. Hospitals can't afford to do that. And if they do get infected, they often cannot afford to not pay the ransom. And the hackers know that, the cyber criminals know that. I mean, there's some evidence that they're actually focusing increasingly on healthcare as a sector. One other thing, John Riggy, who is the former senior FBI cybercrime hunter, who now works for the American Hospitals Association, said that in his view, because this is the second attack that has focused on a upstream supplier for the healthcare system, right? Where there was an attack on actually it's European-based company that runs blood donation centres in the US, among other places, in about 20 states. That was all closed down. That was last year. He believes that they are deliberately focusing on these systemic pressure points because that, again, you can't afford not to pay. I mean, there's a broader question looming sort of in the background behind all this, which is, what is the relationship of the Russian government to the activities of these Russian speaking cybercrime gangs? And I say that because not all of them are actually based in Russia. I mean, they might be based in Belarusia, they might be based in Ukraine, especially in Russian-occupied eastern Ukraine, but they are Russian-speaking cyber gangs, and all the former Soviet republics like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, but they're Russian-speaking ransomware gangs. And as you probably remember, Curtis, right after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there was a lot of sort of discussion about what role the government, because we know that they don't go after them, right? Except when they want to do theatre for it, right? Except when they want to make a big show of it. So we know that they provide a sort of safe harbour, and the deal by and large appears to be, if you don't target Russians, if you don't victimise Russian organisations, we don't care. But there was also the Conti leaks, if you remember that, this huge dump of message traffic from the Conti ransomware gang also revealed that behind the scenes there was some targeting advice or instructions perhaps being being received from handlers, basically, in the Russian intelligence services. So now, and we know that the Russians have in Europe launched this sort of hybrid warfare campaign below the level of armed conflict, right? They haven't been, sending bombers into Germany, but they've been sending assassins. They've been sending saboteurs, arsonists, thieves, and spies. There was a plot to murder the CEO of Rheinmetall, which is Germany's largest armaments firm. There was a mysterious warehouse fire, that impacted supplies headed for the Ukraine front. So the Russians are doing that in Europe. And the question in my mind is, and I'm going to keep reporting until I find the answer, if it's findable, is this a part of a similar campaign against the United States? Is the focus on healthcare by these Russian-speaking cybercrime organizations, is that a deliberate strategy by the Kremlin to punish the United States for its support for Ukraine? I think that's a very important question, and I'm going to try and find out, if anyone knows the answer.
Well, I'm certainly glad that you're on that. And one of the questions I have, if someone listening is part of a healthcare organization, knowing that this is the threat landscape, and really whether it's cyber warfare or just a profound criminal enterprise, what should they be doing to help keep themselves from becoming part of the list of victims?
Well, absolutely. The attribution doesn't matter at one level, does it? I mean, position, no matter who or why it's being done. So, well, the best practices that I've read, from the American Hospitals Association and others, is really organizations have to focus on resiliency. And that is not just cyber resilience, the ability to keep the network operating as long as possible, and to, if it does go down, to get it back up and running as quickly as possible. Not just cyber resilience, but also operational resilience. What would you do if the power went out, if the water went out, if the blood supplies aren't available? I forget who it was that said, plans are useless, planning is essential. The hospitals need to, and other healthcare organisations need to plan, exercise if possible, their emergency procedures. They need to think about how they would cope with these different kinds of supply chain issues that might arise if these attacks continue, which they seem almost certain to. And they need to, but the focus is on resilience. You can't stop a determined and well-resourced attacker, as you know, from getting into your system. Although it has to be said, with the cybercrime, really, you don't have to. You don't have. It's like the bear, right? You don't have to be faster than the bear. You've got to be faster than the guy behind you who's also running away from the bear. With a cybercrime, you don't have to be secure, but if you're more secure, unfortunately, than the next organization, then that's who the hackers are going to go after. So you have to keep your security posture as secure as you can, and you have to be ready, nonetheless, to be attacked successfully, to have a plan in place to deal with it if that happens.
Well, Shaun, real quickly, we're running to the end of our time, but has OneBlood managed to be sufficiently resilient to recover from this, or are they still down?
No, they, according to some reports in the Florida press that I was looking at earlier, they have returned to normal operations. Often organizations are down for a lot longer than that. I mean, it's impossible to say without access to a lot more detail about the attack exactly how successful or otherwise they were at dealing with it. But those automated processes we talked about are back up and running again now, as of the weekend.
Well, as someone who lives in Florida, I am very glad to hear that. Shaun, thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate this, and we'll look forward to the next time we're able to have you on the CyberWatch podcast.
I look forward to it, Curtis. Thank you very much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
We appreciate Shaun Waterman taking the time to talk with us here on the CyberWatch podcast. That's it for this week. Please join us again next week for the CyberWatch podcast, and be sure to visit CyberWatch on LinkedIn and at www.accesspointconsulting.com/cyberwatch. I'm Curtis Franklin. We'll see you next week.